Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. My guest this week, I'm very excited to tell you, is Bill McKibben. I've been reading things that Bill has written for decades. One of the smartest guys out there talking about issues related to energy, the environment, and climate, literally for 40 years. And he has written a great book called Here Comes the Sun. By the time this comes out, the book will be available for general purchase wherever you buy books. Do get it. I think you'll really like it. It's actually a pretty easy read, a couple hundred pages, not super long, but just absolutely dense, full of great vignettes and stories of Bill's travels to different places around the world and what he's seeing going on with solar. Just a quick little stat that he drops into the book. The Economist in 2009, when we had 23 gigawatts of solar around the world, predicted it would take 20 years to increase that by an order of magnitude. It took 6. And this year, well ahead of that 2030, we are installing that much solar, 230, 240 gigawatts every 6 months globally. Not only did it not take 20 years, we're deploying that much twice per year. This book is just full of all kinds of stuff like that. Pretty much every naysayer argument you hear about solar, there's too much land, it's not recycled and ends up in landfills. He takes on every single one of those in individual chapters. Really love this book. Do order it. But first, listen to my conversation with Bill. We obviously, on brand, talked a whole lot about Texas, but we talked about Pakistan and China and all sorts of places and aspects of the solar story around the world. I hope you enjoy it. As always, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. It really does help grow the audience. Please share this with friends, families, and colleagues. And with that, please enjoy my conversation with Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben, welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast.
Doug, what a pleasure to be with you and to get to say thanks in person for the amazing work you've been doing these last few years.
Bill, that means so much coming from you. I've been reading your stuff for years, even decades. You're just a tremendous source of knowledge and wisdom, and really appreciate you taking time to be on the podcast, and appreciate you writing this fantastic book, Here Comes the Sun, which we'll talk about a lot of different things, but obviously we're going to talk about the book. I can't recommend it highly enough. It is just a great shot in the arm, but kind of a, shot in the arm, not shot at the arm. Let me correct that. Shot in the arm of optimism and sunny optimism. Bill, I got to say though, this is like maybe a little out of character for you. So like what's going on? Why are you so hopeful and excited?
Well, it is true. I had in some ways, maybe the bad luck to write the first book about what we now call the climate crisis, what we then called the greenhouse effect back in the 1980s. So in some ways, my career over 20 subsequent books has been professional bummer outer of people, for which I make no apologies. This is the most important thing that's happened in the course of our species' existence on the planet, and we need to understand it. Finally, right now, even though, from my point of view, there are many, many, many big bad things happening in our country and on our planet. In certain ways, I never remember a moment more fraught than this one. I am saddened by what's going on in our nation. And I have the interesting task at this moment of helping bring people news of the one big good thing that's happening on planet Earth. And that's finally, the breakout of clean energy, the thing that we've been waiting for and hoping for and working for a very long time. And now, a combination of activism and engineering has brought us to a moment when there's this extraordinary thing happening. And my experience is that almost nobody knows about it. A cut from this book came out in the New Yorker earlier this summer, long chunk. And I heard from person after person, and I'm talking about people who've been very active in the energy climate world for a very long time. And they were saying the same thing over and over again. I had no idea that this was happening. I had no idea how fast this was going. And I think that it's one of the really important points that we have to get across right now for all kinds of important political reasons is this stuff is no longer alternative energy. We should toss that framing far away. We should tear down the walls of that particular ghetto. This is the common sense, straightforward, obvious way to power the planet going forward. There's a very good reason that 95% of the new generation capacity on planet Earth last year was clean energy, sun, wind, batteries. And I mean, you're close to a big part of that story in the Lone Star State, where, which in some ways, as I say in the book, is the most amazing part of that story, since it's happening literally in the hydrocarbon capital of planet Earth. And yet the economics are so remarkable that even without what should be all kinds of obvious reasons to support it environmentally, it's nonetheless making its case. So it's not that I think we're out of the woods. It's not even that I think we're necessarily going to do this in this country. It's that for the very first time in the 4 decades where we've been worried about climate change, we have something that's scalable in ways that'll make a difference. The fact that California is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity this summer than they were 2 years ago is the single most optimistic statistic that I've heard. Those are the kind of numbers that if they spread around the world, start to knock tenths of a degree off how hot the planet eventually gets. And at the same time, they're liberating lots and lots of people from their dependence on expensive and precarious sources of energy is a beautiful part of that story too.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things that I think is so interesting about this moment, and you just hit on it directly when you were talking about the New Yorker article, right? That like I still feel like this is not known. When people talk about alternative energy, they still generally mean wind and solar. And we really do need to turn that upside down. Like gas is becoming alternative energy. Doesn't mean it's not valuable and we won't use it sometimes, but it's kind of the alternative. And then the economics, which I think it was chapter 4, which was probably my favorite chapter because I'm such a nerd and I love the economic stuff and you just lay it out so well. And I think the chapter right after that, you get into can the rest of the world afford it? Because you hear that all the time, right? This almost like trope that's rolled out all the time. They're like, well, there's no way Africa's ever going to get to the level of prosperity that we have unless there's fossil fuels. And it's like, that's crazy. It's exactly upside down because you need big centralized infrastructure and the world has failed over and over and over again to build that kind of scale in Africa, but decentralized, like the move we made in telecom to mobile phones, like that actually has a chance of working. It looks like you want to say something. I'll let you respond to that. There is a question in there, but go ahead and respond and then I'll ask
I
my
just want to
question.
say, I think you're absolutely right. And you can tell because people, as it were, are voting with their feet or with their rooftops. The story that really just blew my mind was what happened in Pakistan over the last
Yes.
year
Yep.
or so. You know, about a year ago in Pakistan, energy analysts started saying something weird is happening because demand for electricity on the national grid is dropping. As you know, as an energy analyst, humans never use less energy. Demand number always goes up, as they say. So the fact that it was dropping was befuddling. What was happening here? And then good analysts started looking at pictures on Google Earth. And if you looked at the rooftops of Lahore or Karachi or Islamabad, you could literally watch solar panels spreading like, mushrooms after a rainstorm in the woods. I mean, the growth was literally week to week. In the course of 8 months last year, Pakistanis built the equivalent of half the country's national electric grid by themselves. And when I talked to people and said, "How did people even, like, manage to do it?" Obviously, the key component was cheap Chinese solar panels coming across the border with China.
Yep.
But
Yep.
but how did they put them up? Well, it turns out that there are 3 or 400 great TikTok videos with Hindustani music in the background where people explain how to snap this stuff together
Wow.
and how to put it up.
DIY.
And,
Yeah.
the bottom line there, the number that killed me was that I mean, I've spent some time in rural Asia, so I know that the soundtrack of village Asia is diesel generators humming along to pump those deep tube wells that were the residue of the green revolution of the '60s. That diesel is usually the biggest input for farmers. It's expensive. Farmers were the first people to really start doing this in Pakistan. They often lack the money to build the steel supports that we're used to seeing for solar panels. They're just buying them, laying them on the ground, pointing them at the sun. Diesel sales dropped 35% last year in Pakistan in 1 year. Those are the kind of numbers that change the world.
Absolutely. And I had a sense that we were quote unquote winning. And I want to talk about what winning means in a minute, because I don't mean that, team jerseys, like it's not a zero sum game. Humanity, all of us are winning. When I started to hear more and more that oil and gas operators in the Permian Basin were trying to hook up to the grid as fast as they could to abandon those diesel generation gensets and units, because it is more expensive to use those. And the input cost of producing a barrel of oil includes the cost of the energy it takes to so it was kind of like, I mean, I had seen all the numbers and I knew solar was coming, but that was one of those moments where I kind of went, oh shit, this is really happening.
It is just fascinating. And it's going to take us a while to wrap our heads around it because we're so used to the idea of energy as commodity, as something that you go discover and put in reserves. And, the idea that energy now is going to be more than anything else kind of the product of human intelligence. The fact that the learning curves are so steady and so steep for these technologies that they get cheaper and cheaper with each passing quarter. Most of the global warming era, we lived in a world where fossil fuel was cheap and clean energy was expensive. That's why so much activism had to be about trying to put price on carbon, trying to divest from fossil fuels so that the cost of capital would rise, trying to slow the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, on and on. But sometime about 5 years ago, we crossed that line. That flipped, and now we're in a different world, and the parameters of that world are going to keep shifting in the same direction. Fossil fuel is not on a learning curve. Fossil fuel was always pretty cheap, but if anything, it gets more expensive because now you have to go deep beneath the ocean or down and frack the subsurface geology or whatever it is to get at it. I mean, the coal is further back in the coal mine and it takes more effort to get. This stuff just gets easier all the time. The one real critique of the economics here, I think, is that it's almost so cheap that it's difficult to make a big profit on it, and so it's going to be more difficult to mobilize some of the investment if that's sort of how we're doing it. You've seen Brett Christopher's good book about this, The Price is Wrong, but the price is so cheap that I think places like China are quickly figuring out that the whole world looks different on the other side. Manufacturing, like just the daily cost of living, like all the things that we do in this world with energy become so radically less expensive once we've built this out that it's as if you're living in a different world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I still think there's going to be plenty of opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities. It is, I think, a move away from the commodity, as you talked about a minute ago, and more to services. And this was the most recent podcast I just put out was with the CEO of Octopus, and I did one with Base Power, like these kinds of companies that are starting to think of like, what do people really want beyond the commodity? Because if the commodity becomes so cheap, which it might.
Absolutely.
It's happening. It's still, I think, debatable whether or not that happens, right? But certainly the evidence is pointing that way. So then it kind of becomes what are the services you can offer and how do you
Uh,
actually,
there
you
was an
know
instructive story in the paper yesterday about one of the big Australian utility and coal firms making a huge investment in batteries, just saying, clearly one of our markets is disappearing and another is emerging. I think in general, not to sound too hippy-dippy about all this. But I do think that there's something fascinating about imagining a world that runs on energy that can't really be hoarded over long times, held in reserve. It's a fun mental game to play to try and think what the geopolitics of planet Earth would have been like over the last 50 years if oil was not a particularly valuable product, you know? I mean, human beings are good at fighting about things, but even human beings are gonna have a hard time figuring out how you fight a war over sunshine, you know? So there are some big, interesting differences emerging. And of course, I'm not the only one that realizes that, nor you. Much of American politics over the last year is explicable by the fact that people in the oil and gas industry looked at the fact that California was suddenly using 40% less natural gas and panicked. You know, it was just about exactly a year ago that candidate Trump was saying, "Give me $1 billion and you can have anything you want," to the oil industry. They ponied up more like 500 million when you add in all the advertising and lobbying and direct donations. Clearly, that was enough, but they're getting everything that they wanted. But my
Well, sort
yeah,
of,
no,
Bill.
I know.
Actually, it's really fascinating. Yeah,
They're getting
yeah.
all the
Yeah, because
policy
because
they
because
want.
drill yeah, they're getting some of what they wanted, certainly with some of, like, well, some of them, not to paint with too broad a brush with the IRA repeals and some of that kinda stuff, but I think this is a really important but, like, the drill baby
Yep,
drill stuff does
not
not
happening.
work to them. To your whole point of, like, you need some scarcity for higher prices, and one of the things I love, and I recommend it to anybody who's interested in energy, is look at the regular reports that come out of the Dallas Federal Reserve, which really tracks oil and gas, and they do a quarterly survey, and they publish the comments they get, and the comments are withering, like oil and gas executives just saying the policy of this administration towards oil and gas doesn't make sense. I think there's some buyer's remorse. And we heard this before the election. Exxon CEO said, gave an interview on CNBC and said, I don't know what drill baby drill as a policy actually means because once you drill enough, then the prices go down. And what happens when the prices go down? People don't drill as much. So you get caught in a quandary there, right?
Well, yes, and truthfully, I think that they waited too long. We're past the point of no return at some level in the transition to clean energy, partly because it's such a global phenomenon. I think the interesting thing to watch is going to be what happens with LNG export, because clearly that's where this industry has based its growth story on going forward. We're going to export endless amounts of LNG out of the Gulf of Mexico to the rest of the world. And obviously, Trump is doing his best to help with that. Place after place, the tariff negotiation has ended up with people promising to buy hundreds of billions of dollars worth of LNG. But my guess is that while that may be a short term boost, a kind of sugar high, it's probably not going to last. A, because it's running counter to these economics, but B, because if you're the ruler of some Asian country someplace, and you look at this, do you really want your energy future tied to the increasingly fickle and erratic American government? Do you really want to put yourself in a place where Donald Trump can decide that your Supreme Court did something he didn't like and so he's cutting you off? Or my guess is that you're going to see almost the opposite reaction of what they want over time.
There's a lot of different businesses, a lot of different sectors, including energy, where folks are asking themselves, do you want to rely on the fickleness of the American government right now? But to come back to the point of LNG, and this is where I do think we will see gas become more and more of that alternative energy, is because, again, the more you export, the more scarce it becomes and the higher the price goes. And right. And we see this EIA just came out with a couple days ago, a new short-term outlook that has gas prices up in the $4.50, $5 range. The last 2 years, it's been like $2. So it's weird. We're actually seeing, you talked about gas being down in California, and that's part of the reason it is more expensive this year. We're seeing solar and wind way up in Texas. Unfortunately, we're seeing coal up too and gas down because demand is rising so much faster here than California. We're seeing everything rise except for gas. And that's with it only being like 3.5, $4. If it gets to 4.5, 5, I think you see even more solar and wind. I want to pivot a little bit, but do you have anything you want to add to that, or is it okay if I pivot here?
No, just to say, I do think that it's really important for people to bear in mind what a global story this is. And it's not just the energy sources themselves, it's the appliances that make use of them. So the fact that half the cars sold in China last month came with plugs dangling from the end is an extraordinary part of this story. There's no story.
And they're not going back, right? It's not like it's going to dip below
No.
50%. It's only going up from
I mean,
here.
once you've built the infrastructure, I mean, the story is these are better machines, you know? An electric vehicle is a
Yeah,
better
absolutely.
I've
Yeah.
driven one for years. I would never go back for anything, nor would I get rid of the heat pump in my house and replace it with a furnace and an air conditioner. This is better stuff that also happily happens to be better for the world. But any story about global oil demand 10 years down the road depends on everybody in China deciding they wanna drive, I don't know what, a Bronco or something with a gas tank, and that's just not going to happen. In fact, the opposite is gonna happen.
Yeah, which they would have to pay
Yeah,
like 40,
yeah.
50,000 bucks for, especially after the tariffs the other way. And then like the electric vehicles in China are down to 10, $15,000 for like a really, really nice car.
For 12 grand, you can buy a car, I mean, that does stuff American cars can't do. The future now, sadly, gets written at the, Shanghai Auto Show, not the Detroit Auto Show. And all of this, I will just add, as a patriotic American, pisses me off. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts. My summer job was giving tours of the Battle Green, where the American idea was first defended in blood.
I've been there. It's a great site, by the way. I loved it there. It was awesome.
And the fact that the country that invented the solar cell and the country that invented
Yeah.
the lithium ion battery is just surrendering.
Yeah.
It's not that China's gonna eat our lunch, it's we're catering the lunch. We're sending over a bunch of waiters in red caps to serve lunch to the Chinese, and it is absolutely maddening and should be to any red-blooded American to watch that happen.
Yeah, we're going to put a pin in that. Hopefully, we'll have time to come back to that. If not, well, I'll have you back on the podcast at some point in the future. We'll talk about electro states
Yes.
versus petro states and what it means that China is dominating the supply chain for not just EVs and solar panels, but transformers. There's a big, big issue there that we've got to deal with as a country. But I don't want to lose the earlier point, which you were just saying. This was the pivot I wanted to make, and you made it excellently, which is the EVs are better, the heat pumps are better. This, to me, we're at a critical inflection point in dealing with climate change. That if we lead with climate change, and it feels like, I mean, you pretty much said this in the book. You certainly were like going right up to it, and I think even beyond it, like pushing the boundaries here a little bit. I want to push the boundaries a little further, Bill. And look, I want to be really clear. We can't ignore the climate science. I spend a good part of my any given week reading what's coming out and different climate scientists, Andrew Dessler down here in Texas. I could give a long list of the people
Mm.
that I look to that are really, really smart.
Catherine Hayhoe,
Yeah,
yes.
also in
Yeah.
Texas. Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, we've got a
Yes,
bunch of
you
them.
got a good Texas contingent.
I really could. I'm going to stop myself from naming them because then I'd leave somebody out and somebody will get mad at me. But they're legion and they're smart, and the contribution they're making is important and it should not be ignored. And when we think about the mass of people, right, the general public that is not reading about climate science, they're trying to live their lives. More than half of Texans are struggling to pay their energy bill because it's too high. There was a great survey out of Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. I'm going to have Margot, the director of that organization, on the podcast next month. It'll be a must listen. They did this Community Voices Energy survey. Right at about 50% of Texans are reporting that they're choosing between their food, medicine, and power. And I think if we lead with climate change, it's very depressing.
Mhm,
It is a
mhm.
hard thing. It is complicated and it is depressing as hell. And so people are just like, I have so many problems in my life and now you want me to deal with this, and I have no power to deal with that. Now flip that around and say, "Hey, what is happening to deal with climate change? You don't even have to think about it to deal with climate change. These are technologies that lower your energy costs, give you a better, smoother, faster ride in your car, keep your house more comfortable at lower cost in extreme heat, especially winter, whatever. Like that pivot, I feel like is where you're going here. It just had me so excited reading this book because you obviously are a pivotal figure within those that are working on climate change. I think we have to get back to like, what is the purpose? Where does this end? What is the vision? What is the light at the end of that tunnel? If we successfully deal with climate change, it's not privation and
Mhm.
higher prices and you're putting on extra layers to stay warm in the winter. It's none of that. It's actually energy abundance, really an end of scarcity for a lot of different things.
So I think you're absolutely on the right track. I want to say a few things about climate that I think are important here. I don't think it's going to go away in any way, in part because those feelings of privation are now directly linked to what's happening to the climate. I mean, the fact that Texans are having to use so much expensive energy has a lot to do with the fact that the temperature now pins at 100 degrees beginning in May and stays there till October. And obviously comes with all the kind of tragedies that y'all have dealt with in the hill country. I also think that human beings are complicated and that we make a mistake sometimes in assuming that we work just on a kind of economic cost benefit analysis when we think about the world. Humans like to be
True.
engaged in the process of making the world a better place. They care deeply about a world that works better for their kids and such. And that's why it's exciting that the one thing that we can do about climate change also happens to be a beautiful thing that we can do for everybody's future. The epochal moment that we're at shouldn't be washed over. Right now, in the 2020s, after 700,000 years of humans merrily setting things on fire, we're at a point where we don't need to do that anymore. And that comes with extraordinary benefits. The climate is perhaps the most abstract of those. One of the least abstract is that we don't need to be causing hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma across this country every year anymore by sending up the cloud of particulates that come when you burn fossil fuel. That's a big help, especially in places that are hot and poor. But we also have this chance of building a future that is in our own control, which is another thing of great emotional appeal to people. Most people don't have their own supply of coal or gas or oil. At least since John D. Rockefeller, a great deal of the intense and now grotesque inequality that marks our planet has derived from the fact that we depend on these few outcroppings of fossil fuel scattered around the world. The people who control them become richer and more powerful than is wise for our democracy or wise for our economy. Imagining a world where instead communities have some control over that. I was so struck by your reporting earlier this year during the state legislative session in Texas when people started appearing out of rural Texas saying, don't do this stuff on solar. This is how we pay for our schools now. That revenue source is what keeps our otherwise remote, rural, impoverished community going. And that could be true for the entire world.
I just want to interject to say one of my favorite phrases that I've just ever heard on anything is from John Davis, a former Republican legislator. He was a chairman in the House, Republican in the aughts and I think into the early teens. He's got a ranch out in Menard, about 3 hours west of Austin. There's no oil and gas on his ranch. I think he's fourth generation, maybe fifth. And he was getting ready to like get to the point where he was not going to be able to keep his ranch. He just couldn't keep up with the expenses of it. Cattle wasn't bringing enough money in. He was heartbroken, but it's like it was a financial decision he's gonna have to make. And then he said, as he describes it, I struck wind. Right. He didn't strike oil, he struck wind. He's got 7 wind turbines. There's a great article in the Telegraph. We'll put a link in the show notes where he says, 40% of his income now is coming from those 7 wind turbines. And the cattle graze right around the wind turbines and don't have any problem. This whole thing of like taking away farmland, like the cattle are perfectly happy. They go and get shade from the tower at certain times of the day, and that's about all it affects them.
Let's don't overlook that at all because it turns out that that's one of the really fun parts of this story.
And of your book, by the way, the whole section on land is just so well done. Yeah.
Agrivoltaics, I mean, we live on an overheating planet where shade is actually a really useful commodity all of a sudden.
Yep.
So you don't have to
Yep.
look very far on the internet to find lots of pictures of sheep and cows happily lolling in the shade of solar panels. I will say to anybody listening that the word to the wise, don't put your goats in there. They like to eat the cables and they
Yeah.
enjoy trying to jump up on the panels themselves. So keep the goats away, but everything else, I mean,
Sheep work fine. Yes, not
the
goats.
French have
Yes.
figured out that they're increasing yields of wine grapes 60% by sticking them, in fields where you get more
Love it.
shade and, of course, more moisture retention as a result. And I think that this part of the story, people are starting to understand a little better. If I go to my grave having only explained one thing, it would be that we could take the land currently used to grow ethanol in this country and cover it with solar panels and provide more energy than the US will ever use. The insanity was driven home for me standing in a field in Illinois with a farmer who, put part of his acreage into solar. He said, we grew a lot of ethanol, a lot of corn for ethanol here. 1 acre of corn grown for ethanol every year produces enough to drive my Ford F-150 about 25,000 miles. So not nothing, but 1 acre of that same land covered with solar panels, with other stuff in between, but covered with solar panels, produces enough electricity to take my Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version, not 25,000 miles, but about 700,000 miles. When you start getting those kind of figures in your head, you get the sense of what's possible here. And you get the sense of how easily this can and does cross ideological lines. That's what I've been loving about your reporting from Austin. And it's not the only place. One of my favorite stories this year is about, and it's not like a crucial central part of the solar story, but it's a really good one. In the last couple of years across Europe, this stuff called balcony solar has just taken off for apartment dwellers. There's
Yep.
apparently several million
Yep.
Germans have gone to whatever the German equivalent of Best Buy is and plunked down a few €100 and come home with a solar panel that they hang from the balcony and just plug straight into the wall. And they're producing 20% of the power they use, maybe. That's illegal everywhere in this country, except in that progressive bastion, Utah, where 2 months ago, a libertarian state senator said, "Why can the people of Hamburg and Frankfurt do this and not the good people of Salt Lake and Provo? I don't like this." And so unanimously, the state legislature passed the enabling legislation. And I now have a steady diet of videos on YouTube of Utahns hanging their balcony solar panels off and plugging them in and generating power. If you're a good liberal, you may love the idea that we're networking the groovy power of the sun. If you're a my home is my castle kind of guy, you may like the idea that you're now actually independent of the big powers and able to, run
And
your own
maybe you
thing.
like both, right? Right?
Absolutely.
Maybe like we
We're
contain
all we're all
multitudes
we're
and
all
both of
Americans,
those
so
things
we
are
have
great.
we we
Yes.
we we have a little bit
Yes.
of all of this in us, and it's why we're doing this Sunday thing in September, this big national day of action on September 21st, the fall equinox, just to try and drive this message home, and we kicked it off with a little ceremony at Old North Church in Boston, where we hung a solar-powered green lantern up in Paul Revere's steeple because this is such a possibility. And that kind of liberation story, revolution story, is so akin to what I've always thought of as the kind of American spirit, and so antithetical to what at the moment, I think, too many people are perceiving as where we just try to hold on and never change to what we have now. If we've powered the country on coal, then we're gonna power it on coal forever. Well, I mean, as I say, I grew up in Lexington. If that had been we'd still be speaking with British accents and sending money off to the king.
And using whale oil and kerosene and yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
this is the moment, and it's great fun for me. My other identity, in a sense, I guess, is as a Christian. I've been a Methodist Sunday school teacher much of my life and that kind of thing. And so I love the idea that we're getting energy from heaven, not from hell, that the good Lord saw fit to hang this big ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky. And now we have the wit to make full use of it. I was very taken by the news a couple of weeks ago that Vatican City is now going to become the first fully solar powered nation on earth. They just broke ground on a big solar farm outside Rome. And given the nature of solar power, within a few months, they will have finished this project and the Vatican City will be running all on solar power. So for me, the climate story is this in the middle of all of this. And the only reason that we're doing the kind of activism that we're doing is we have to make this transition as quickly as possible. Unlike our other political issues, the thing that makes it different is it's one that comes with a hard physical deadline. Once we melt the whole Arctic, it's not like someone has a plan for how we're gonna freeze it back up again, and that's about where we are now. We're watching in real time the degradation of the climate. So, absent that, we could all just sit back. I could sit back and say, well, 40 years from now, we're gonna run the planet on sun and wind because it's so obviously economically the thing to do, and economics eventually erodes politics and wins. The trouble is if it takes us anything like 40 years, then the planet that we run on sun and wind and batteries is going to be a broken planet. So that's the one place where I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that this good news story is happening at the same time as a very bad news story, and they're very deeply connected. So deeply connected that it's almost like a Hollywood script. June of 2023 was the month when temperatures around the world really began this acceleration, this spike. That was the month when climatologists were saying this is the hottest temperature we've seen in 125,000 years. And every month since has been, the hottest October, the second hottest May, whatever. We've stayed up at this very elevated place. Well, June of 2023 was also literally the same month when human beings started putting up more than a gigawatt's worth of solar panels every day around the world. A gigawatt being one can talk about nameplate capacity on it, but being the rough equivalent of a coal-fired power plant or something.
A very large one, yeah.
So these two things are happening right now, and we have no idea how this race comes out. We know that we're not going to stop global warming. It's too late for that. Much damage already done, much more to come. But what we're playing for is the ability to stop it short of the place where it just cuts civilizations off at the knees. And even that's an open question, and we don't know. But I think that your original point was right, that by itself, that has not been enough to move our political system in the ways that we would need it to move. This is an extraordinary opportunity that comes with cheap, clean energy. And so the shorthand that I've been using for people that help get it across is to say, we've spent a long time thinking of this stuff as like the Whole Foods of energy. It's nice, but it's pricey. We need to get it through everybody's minds that this is the Costco of energy. It's cheap, it's available in bulk, it's on the shelf, ready to go.
So it hasn't been enough politically. I want to read a little part. This is from towards the end of the book, not right at the end, but a little quote you had here. You said, "We're finding enthusiasts around the world, not for net zero by 2050 or dramatic reductions in carbon emissions or any of the other phrases that have come to define the climate debate. It's not that those things aren't important, they are. It's that they don't really offer a positive vision of the world we might build." I agree with this 1,000%. And I wanna tie this together with what I thought was just a great podcast that I recommend everybody listen to, the Ezra Klein Show, the one he did with Jesse Jenkins and Jane Flagle, who I think are, two of the brightest minds in energy out there. You were just talking a minute ago, Bill, about Utah and about, what is effectively a little bit of a deregulatory action, right? Making it easier for people to plug and play a solar panel if it's configured that way and it can work in a normal socket and provide power. Like, again, they're doing this all over the world. It's not dangerous. Why wouldn't we give the people the freedom to do that? And so basically what I'm getting at is we are getting to a point that to deal effectively with climate change, to deal effectively with the rising temperatures and the heat and all that comes from that, we are going to have to build a lot. And the environmental movement has existed for decades to really stop infrastructure from being, but that's an oversimplification. It hasn't existed 100% for that. But I think it's fair to say a lot of the orientation of the environmental movement, and I'm not saying that is like a bad thing. There was a move in Texas 20 years ago to build 11 coal plants. And I was a long time ago, like trying to stop those. And I'm glad I did. We shouldn't have built those. So it's not a bad thing to stop some infrastructure from being built. But now we're at this point where, like, oh my God, to get out of the mess we're in, we got to build and we got to build a lot. And I just wrote an article on this talking about energy pragmatism and how maybe it's not crazy, although there's a little voice inside my head telling me it is crazy to think we could get any sort of bipartisan energy. You only have to read any newspaper any day and be like, how is that possibly going to happen? But we've been polarized before, and energy does seem to be an area where bipartisan agreement can happen. But that, of course, means that progressives are going to have to give something to get something. So you could take any part of that what you want, but I think the main question is this a time where progressives, where people that are concerned about climate change should be actively working with conservatives on what motivates them to come up with some kind of a bipartisan energy framework that might be able to propel us forward?
Sure. First thing is, I've done a lot of writing in the last couple of years about just what you're talking about. And what the case I've been trying to make, among other things, is that people who, like me, old white people, should stop suing to stop things they don't like. Solar farms, wind, I am so tired of the I don't want to look at it argument, which actually is behind an awful lot of the opposition to renewable energy. And it's shameful at this point and should be abandoned. I don't think, frankly, anything useful is going to happen in Washington. I see no sign. Politics aside, it just seems to me that the place has been abandoned to a kind of nonlinear, uninteresting thinking in every way. But I do think that state by state and city by city across this country, there are all kinds of ways to work this out. One of the things we're really concentrating on at Sunday is permitting reform at the local and state level. Because, among other things, I mean, and this is sort of most obvious with rooftop solar, our system's just absurd. I mean, if you live in Australia or Belgium or something, you can call up the contractor on Monday and say, I want solar panels on my roof. And by Friday, they're up there plugged into the grid producing power. Here, it's a months long
At a
odyssey.
dollar a watt
Yeah,
in
at a
Australia.
third the price, at 50 cents a watt increasingly in Australia. I mean, it's really unbelievable. And as it turns out, I wrote a long piece for the progressive magazine Mother Jones, pointing out that this is mostly down to absurd regulation. We have 15,000 municipalities and county commissions and stuff that all have their own sets of codes. They do these, inspections on the roof as if you were building something dangerous. Clearly, this is not dangerous. If there were an epidemic of solar panel rooftop fires across Australia, trust me, Fox News would be covering them 24/7, okay? This is no more dangerous than putting in a refrigerator, but we treat it as if it's, I don't even know what, someone wants applying to build like a toxic waste dump on their roof.
It's an electrical appliance, and we have batteries in all, like, in our computers and our phones, and then we treat a battery on the
Yeah, yeah,
wall in
yeah.
the garage
We're
like it's
so
some.
used to doing this and so able to do it. And so I think we can change those things in lots of places. And I've really been enjoying working sort of across. There's a group called Conservatives for Clean Energy in the Southeast. They were really the ones who persuaded Governor DeSantis in Florida not to put the kibosh on solar there. And the Sunshine State is actually now beginning to put up solar at a semi-respectable rate.
It's
Um,
literally
you
called
know?
the Sunshine State.
Yeah, yes. This one of the things that always amuses me is that Vermont, where I am, which is not the Sunshine State, has
No.
for decades had one of the highest levels of solar penetration in the country
Yeah.
just because, people are that way.
Mhm.
But we can do this. And so I think that your analysis is correct. And I think that, if and when sanity returns to Washington, it will probably return with a kind of different flavor of thought around that kind of regulation. That said, the baleful effect that the fossil fuel industry has on our political life is just worth bearing in mind all the time. And they're very good at taking things and twisting them in their favor. So, the one part of the IRA that is going to survive, for instance, is the boondoggle stuff that Joe Manchin put in at the behest of the fossil fuel industry. We're going to spend tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars on what are really kind of absurd, expensive projects like carbon capture from coal fired power plants and things like that. Money that, if you spent it on renewable energy, would return 10 times the climate benefits, but also 10 times the economic benefits. So I understand why people are reluctant to help an industry on the decline try and maintain its advantage through political gamesmanship. That said, this is a transition. And there are communities that depend on fossil fuel and people
Well, a
that
lot of them in
depend on it,
Texas. Yeah.
and we
Yep.
need to
Yeah.
figure out how
Yep.
to
Yep.
make that work. Exactly right. We need to figure out how to make that work, and I think we can. I think the thing that we can't figure out how to make work is a forever return for Exxon's shareholders. I was really struck last year when Darren Woods said, quite frankly, in response to the obvious question, "Why don't you guys build a lot of renewable energy? You're an energy company." He said, "We don't do it because it doesn't offer above average returns for our investors." They've had 100 years to realize above average returns. It's about time for the rest of us to realize the kind of savings and freedom that comes from not relying on energy that can be hoarded, held in reserve, doled out month by month for another check, you
Yeah.
know?
I know I need to let you go in a minute. Two quick points, and then
Yes.
I'm going to ask you if there's anything else you want to say before we end. One, Exxon is investing in lithium mining in certainly in Arkansas, maybe in Northeast Texas. So they're changing. Two, I think as far as DC goes, obviously nobody has a high opinion of Congress right now. I mean, the polling puts Congress, slightly below the plague or something like that. But I think there are, particularly in the Senate, a lot of folks that understand that if we severely limit the build out of wind and solar, it will affect many of our other national goals, including winning the AI race with China, which is very important to the Trump administration and a lot of folks in Congress. So, like, I still have this, like, it may be a very thin thread of hope that there might be some ability to have a bipartisan bill like in 2005, like in 2007, 2015. So I'll let you respond to that. And then, because I know I need to let you go, if there's anything else you want to say in
Let's hope.
closing.
I'll just say, I hope a few of them grow a spine and are willing to stand up to the White House on some of this,
Yes.
and we'll see. But that's why we're doing things like Sunday. It's really important to demonstrate across the country that there's an understanding and a desire for this future. And if we change the politics even in small ways, then that has the possibility for the kind of outcomes that you're describing.
Bill, if people want to know more about Sunday, they can go to, what is it, Sunday.Earth, and it's going to happen on September 21st. Is that right?
Sunday.Earth.
Okay.
Exactly right. You got it just right. Doug, let me just say such thanks for what you do. You're doing it in the most important place in the world and just in exactly the right key. So many, many thanks.
Bill, really appreciate you. We will put links to where folks can read your excellent Substack. Can't recommend that highly enough. And then Here Comes the Sun, depending on when we put this out, it'll either already be out or you could pre-order it. Highly
I think
recommend the
it's
book.
out next week. So yeah, I am glad you enjoyed it.
So it'll probably already be out. Make sure you order it, and we'll put links to other places people can find you. Bill, thanks so much for doing this. This was a pleasure. Thank you.
A real pleasure. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the Energy Capital Podcast. If you got something out of this conversation, please share the podcast with a friend, family member, or colleague, and subscribe to the newsletter at douglewin.com. That's where you'll find all the stories where I break down the biggest things happening in Texas energy, national energy policy, markets, technology policy. It's all there. You can also follow along at LinkedIn. You can find me there, and at Twitter, Doug Lewin Energy, as well as YouTube, Doug Lewin Energy. Please follow me in all the places. Big thanks to Nathan Peavy, our producer, for making these episodes sound so crystal clear and good, and to Ari Lewin for writing the music. Until next time, please stay curious and stay engaged. Let's keep building a better energy future. Thanks for listening.